A mother stretching a single dollar to feed 5 children, a father working 3 jobs and still falling behind on rent, kids playing in streets where hope felt like a foreign language. The 1960s in New York were not golden years for everyone. While some danced through prosperity, entire neighborhoods were quietly drowning, forgotten by the city, ignored by the country. Today we walk through the 10 poorest neighborhoods of 1960s New York. These are the places no one talked about then, and most people have forgotten now. If you wanted to see poverty with your own eyes in 1960, you took the train to Brownsville. This Brooklyn neighborhood had once been a thriving Jewish community, home to immigrants who believed in tomorrow. By the 60s, tomorrow had stopped coming. White flight emptied the streets. Landlords abandoned buildings rather than maintain them. The city looked the other way. What remained was a neighborhood of Black and Puerto Rican families who had nowhere else to go. The projects rose like concrete monuments to failure, stacking poverty vertically instead of solving it. Pitkin Avenue, once bustling with shops and dreams, became a strip of boarded windows and broken promises. Unemployment was not a statistic in Brownsville, it was a way of life. Fathers stood on corners because factories would not hire them. Mothers cleaned houses in neighborhoods that would never welcome them as residents. Children grew up fast here, they had to. School was underfunded, overcrowded, a holding. Pen more than a pathway. The streets taught faster lessons anyway. Brownsville in the 60s was where the American dream came to be buried, and nobody even sent flowers. The South Bronx would become famous in the 70s for burning, but in the 60s, it was already dying. The Cross Bronx Expressway had cut through the neighborhood like a surgeon removing a heart, displacing thousands of families and leaving behind a wound that never healed. Robert Moses called it progress. The people who lived there called it destruction. What had been a working-class neighborhood of Irish, Jewish, and Italian families transformed almost overnight. Those who could afford to leave, left. Those who could not stayed and watched everything crumble around them. Landlords discovered that insurance money from fires paid better than rent from poor tenants. The formula was simple: empty the building, strike a match, collect the check. By the mid-60s, the South Bronx had some of the highest poverty rates in the entire country. Gangs filled the vacuum left by vanishing jobs. Heroin filled the vacuum left by vanishing hope. Mott Haven, Hunts Point, Melrose, these names became synonymous with everything America wanted to forget. The Bronx was burning long before the flames became visible. It was burning from neglect. They called it El Barrio, and it belonged to the Puerto Ricans who had arrived by the thousands seeking something better than what they left behind. What they found in East Harlem was not exactly better, it was just different. Tenements that had housed waves of immigrants before them, now crumbling after decades of landlord neglect. Streets alive with Spanish, but starving for opportunity. East Harlem in the 60s was poor in ways that statistics cannot capture. Families doubled and tripled up, and apartments meant for half as many people. Children slept in shifts. Bathrooms were shared between strangers. The welfare office knew every block by heart because every block needed help that never quite arrived. But here is what the poverty numbers never showed. East Harlem had life. Salsa pouring out of windows. Dominoes slapping on tables set up on sidewalks. Abuelas watching over streets like guardian angels with sharp tongues and sharper eyes. The neighborhood was poor, yes, but it was also proud. El Barrio refused to disappear, refused to be erased, refused to stop dancing even when there was nothing left in the refrigerator. That stubborn joy in the face of suffering, that was East Harlem's secret weapon. Bed-Stuy was massive. By the 1960s, it had become the largest Black community in the entire United States, home to nearly 500,000 people packed into brownstones that had seen better days. The neighborhood had history, culture, and more churches per block than anywhere else in the city. What it did not have was money. Redlining had strangled Bed-Stuy for decades. Banks refused to lend. Insurance companies refused to insure. The city refused to invest. So the neighborhood invested in itself. Block associations formed. Churches became community centers. Neighbors became family, because family was the only safety net anyone had. But self-reliance has limits when the system is designed against you. Jobs were scarce. Schools were failing. Housing was deteriorating faster than anyone could repair it. Robert Kennedy visited in 1966 and was shocked by what he saw. He promised change. Some change came. Most did not. Bed-Stuy in the 60s was a neighborhood of enormous potential suffocating under the weight of deliberate neglect. The people were not the problem. The people were the only reason anything worked at all. The Lower East Side had been poor for 100 years by the time the 60s arrived. This was where immigrants first landed and last left, generation after generation. Jews, Italians, Irish, Chinese, Puerto Ricans, each wave arriving with nothing and building something before the next wave pushed them outward. By the 60s, the neighborhood was a patchwork of old poverty and new poverty, living side by side. The tenements here were ancient, built in the 1800s with no thought for light or air or human dignity. Apartments where the bathtub sat in the kitchen because there was nowhere else to put it. Apartments where the toilet was down the hall, shared with strangers. Apartments where coal stoves still provided heat because no one had bothered to modernize buildings full of poor people. What saved the Lower East Side from complete despair was density. So many people packed so tightly together that loneliness was impossible. You knew your neighbors because the walls were thin enough to hear their arguments. You shared food because everyone went hungry at some point. The sidewalks were playgrounds, meeting halls, and living rooms all at once. Poverty on the Lower East Side was communal, and somehow that made it survivable. If Brownsville was where the dream died, East New York was where it was never born. This far corner of Brooklyn sat at the end of subway lines and at the bottom of city priorities. Factories had provided jobs once. By the 60s, the factories were closing or gone. What remained were workers without work and families without futures. The neighborhood had changed rapidly. White ethnic families fled to Long Island, their houses bought by black families who were themselves fleeing worse conditions elsewhere. But the services that had supported the old residents did not transfer to the new ones. Schools declined. Police presence meant harassment, not protection. Garbage piled up because collection routes seemed to skip these blocks. East New York in the 60s was poor and invisible. No famous politicians visited. No newspapers wrote features. No one marched through demanding justice. The neighborhood simply suffered in silence, generation after generation, waiting for attention that never came. Have you ever felt completely forgotten? Multiply that feeling by an entire zip code. That was East New York. Bushwick had been a proud neighborhood of German and Italian immigrants, brewery workers and factory hands who built solid lives in modest homes. Then the breweries closed. Then the factories left. Then the middle class followed. By the 60s, Bushwick was in free fall, and nobody was reaching out to catch it. Puerto Rican and black families moved into the vacuum, inheriting a neighborhood already in decline. The housing stock was aging. The infrastructure was crumbling. The jobs that had once defined Bushwick were memories told by old-timers who remembered better days. Young people grew up with no clear path forward, no factory gates to walk through, no union cards to earn. Poverty in Bushwick had a particular cruelty because you could see what had been lost. The bones of a thriving community were still visible. The old storefronts, the solid brick buildings, the wide avenues designed for a prosperity that had moved away. Walking through Bushwick in 1965 meant walking through a ghost of what working-class New York used to mean. Hunts Point sat where the Bronx touched the water, an industrial zone that had provided jobs for generations. The produce market employed thousands. The factories employed thousands more. But by the 60s, Hunts Point was becoming something else, something harder, something that would eventually make it one of the most notorious neighborhoods in America. The residential areas of Hunts Point were desperately poor. Families lived in the shadow of the elevated trains, apartments shaking every few minutes as the subway thundered past. The pollution from nearby industries settled over the streets like a permanent fog. Children grew up breathing air that tasted like chemicals and playing on sidewalks that never saw direct sunlight. What hope looked like in Hunts Point was a job at the market, hauling crates before dawn, coming home exhausted and underpaid, but at least employed. What despair looked like was everything else. The neighborhood would get worse before it got better and better. Was still decades away. Hunts Point in the 60s was a community holding on by fingernails to the edge of a cliff, knowing the fall was coming but refusing to let go. Geography is destiny, and Red Hook's geography was a curse. This small neighborhood sat on a peninsula in Brooklyn, cut off from the rest of the borough by the Gowanus Expressway, surrounded by water on three sides. Getting in and out was difficult. Getting help was nearly impossible. The docks had provided work once. Longshoremen had given Red Hook a rough but stable economy. When containerization killed the docks, it killed Red Hook's reason for existing. The neighborhood emptied out. Those who stayed were those who had no choice. The projects dominated, massive brick towers holding thousands of families in concentrated poverty with no jobs, no transit, no escape. Red Hook in the 60s was an island of need in a city that had decided not to notice. The isolation was physical and psychological. Kids grew up knowing their neighborhood ended at boundaries most New Yorkers never crossed. The outside world rarely came in. The inside world rarely got out. Red Hook existed in its own painful bubble, waiting for someone to remember it was there. This one might surprise you. Fort Greene today is one of the most desirable neighborhoods in Brooklyn. Brownstones sell for millions. Celebrities walk dogs past cafes where coffee costs $7. But in the 1960s, Fort Greene was a neighborhood that middle-class Brooklyn had written off entirely. The housing projects here were among the largest in the city. Walt Whitman houses, Raymond Ingersoll houses, thousands of families stacked in towers, surrounded by brownstones that landlords refused to maintain. The beautiful architecture that would later attract buyers was crumbling, neglected, abandoned to whoever would take it. Fort Greene was poor, but not broken. The neighborhood had artists before artists were a selling point. It had families who maintained dignity despite conditions designed to strip it away. The transformation that would come later, the money and the fame and the real estate speculation, none of it was visible in 1965. What was visible was need. What was visible was community surviving despite everything. What was visible was a neighborhood that refused to believe its own poverty was permanent. Harlem was not just a neighborhood, it was the capital of Black America. The Renaissance had happened here, the music had been born here, the writers and thinkers and dreamers had gathered here to create something that changed the world. But by the 1960s, Harlem was struggling to survive what it had inspired. The money had never matched the culture. White-owned businesses extracted wealth from the neighborhood for decades. Landlords let buildings rot while collecting rent. The city invested in Midtown and ignored everything north of 96th Street. Harlem remained vibrant on the surface, still producing music and art and ideas, but underneath the vibrancy was grinding poverty that never let up. 125th Street was still the main artery of Black commerce and culture. But look past the Apollo and you saw unemployment lines. Look past the churches and you saw families choosing between food and rent. Harlem in the 60s carried the weight of being a symbol while bearing the burden of being neglected. It was expected to represent Black excellence while being denied the resources that excellence requires. 10 neighborhoods, hundreds of thousands of families, millions of stories that never got told. The poverty of 1960s New York was not an accident. It was architecture. Decisions made in offices far from these streets by people who would never walk them created conditions that trapped generations. Some of these neighborhoods have changed completely. Gentrification replaced poverty with something else, something that pushed the poor somewhere new. Other neighborhoods still struggle, still wait, still hope for attention that never arrives. If you grew up in any of these places, or if your family passed through them on the way to somewhere else, I want to hear that story. What do you remember? What did your parents survive? Drop a comment and let these neighborhoods live again in memory.